catastrophize. I don't want to catastrophize, but it seems to me that public discourse is raging at an all-time raging high. And I was scrolling through Twitter the other day, and I saw a thread by Clouse, who's a professor at an undisclosed Midwest university. And he began to tug apart in a very philosophical and even-handed manner the emotions that are currently being politicized, or the politicization that is currently so emotional. So I reached out to him, and he granted me an interview, and for about an hour, you guys get to listen to him pick apart what's going on and to begin to ask certain questions that I believe lead us toward figuring out how to keep the ship itself from rocking too much. Yeah, there's troubled waters. We're always going to be in troubled waters. But if we can't dwell in a certain sort of manner on the same boat, then we're not going to be able to figure out how to navigate forward. We're not going to be able to do it. So I hope that you find this interview as helpful and insightful as I did. This is Clouse.
Yeah, my major concentration in political philosophy is the ancient stuff, so that's why I'm writing on Aristotle. And then I do American political thought as well.
What do you mean American political thought? In which era?
I focus mostly on, most of my training's been on Abraham Lincoln, and then Alexis de Tocqueville, the French writer.
Okay. And so is that like, did Alexis inform the founding fathers, or did their ideas come in later?
His book gets published in 1835 and 1840, so he's 70 years after. Though I know the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalists, and of them I probably know Jefferson the best. So I dabble.
Well, I wanted to speak with you because principally because there was a short Twitter thread that you put out about the Kavanaugh situation that framed it in a way that was not partisan. It was kind of psychological, but you were basing it out of Aristotle's idea of anger.
That's right.
And I don't have it all to mind. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So that's usually what I try to do on my Twitter account, which I know is unusual for Twitter. I try not to be partisan, which no one can ever do 100% of the time. But frequently what I try to do with approaching these situations is because I am trained as a political scientist and as a political philosopher, I try to understand what's the system that's going on behind this, or the drive or motivation. And there's so much anger in the country, and not just specifically in this country, but there's so much anger. Anger is a really useful political tool, incredibly useful political tool. And so I went back into Aristotle's rhetoric and was just rereading one of the chapters in my dissertation draws pretty heavily on that text, so I know it okay. And the things that he's talking about, the use of anger as a political tool for people giving speeches, is either one of the most powerful tools you can use, or one of the most destructive ones. It really comes down to the judgment of the speaker. So as I was watching the Kavanaugh hearings, as much as I could, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I was watching that and Dr. Ford, the biggest thing I noticed is that everyone's trying to use that same emotion. And no one's being particularly good at it. But if both sides are able to elicit that kind of anger, it's got to be coming from something. And where I end up going with, I think in that thread, was both sides feel like they've been dishonored. And that's the most useful motivation for generating anger, or a kind of anger for Aristotle. So that's where the thread came from.
And is there a way in your mind to either frame or pivot that anger toward reconciliation, or not even reconciliation, but toward something constructive rather than the state that it's being used right now? At least I'm seeing it being used right now.
Here's where going to the American political thought would be useful. I didn't do this in the thread, but so I'm just going to spin off of it here, I suppose. In Federalist 10, Madison writes basically that the greatest danger for a self-governing system is faction, where two groups or multiple groups aren't just against one another ideologically or philosophically, but are actually opposed to the other one having political opportunity, destroying their access to the rights, undermining the protection of the government that it's supposed to exist. And I don't think we've gotten to that part yet in America. We haven't got to where Democrats or Republicans are running and saying, we're going to block Democrats or Republicans from voting next time, or purposely making law undermining the rights of the other group. But we definitely can say that this is the most partisan we've been in a long time. And what's, I think, going on is both sides feel aggrieved in a way that isn't constructive, but because there's not an incentive for civility. One of the faculty members at my university has been studying this in Congress, that the destruction of civility can actually explain most of the, or at least a large portion of the dysfunction in Congress, which on its face makes a certain amount of sense. And so as you degrade those sort of norms, either the people that remember the norms get angry, or everyone just gets angry because they feel they've been disrespected. So the only way I could imagine something like this being constructive is if the anger is redirected toward a third party. And I don't mean a political third party. I mean something outside of the political phenomenon, some sort of major tragedy or some sort of event or a massive war, something like this, in order to redirect the anger outward instead of inward. Though I do think in that thread, I also point to how Aristotle thinks that anger can be mitigated, which is you're either afraid of the person that caused you harm, which I don't think we've got to the point to where the parties are afraid of each other or the members in them, or we have to pity. Or I like the term empathy more. I think it's closer to what the Greek word is. But that's a semantic, I suppose. You have to say that I could imagine myself in your point of view or from your condition, and that's going to mitigate the anger. So in some ways, the partisan divide, and the reaction to the debate has been so perfectly illustrative of this. We don't know how to think from the other point of view. We can't. It's you either completely agree that Dr. Ford was 100% correct, or she's a liar, and there's no in between anywhere, because nuance isn't terribly useful politically, at least not right now.
Yeah, that is a big problem. That it seems like in this state of our country, to be civil, you might come across as weak, or you might be ceding strength by not going for the jugular and not stirring up that passion. But if nobody is really able to use that passion constructively, then we're just going to keep on tearing each other apart. We're going to need a third party. Whereas, is there any way for us to not go in that direction? Or is it just, is there so much momentum in your mind going on right now that there's no way to release that anger other than throwing it out of?
Yeah. So, again, I'll jump back into my toolkit, I suppose. Abraham Lincoln has a speech, his first major political speech, his address to the Lyceum, the Young Men's Lyceum in Illinois, where he talks about the anger that's tearing apart the country in his youth, and so preceding the Civil War, and how at one point the passion that had held together the founding generation, being forged by the Revolutionary War, that passion that was directed externally to the British enemy had turned in on itself. And now, instead of being forged in the heat of a great enemy, now we see each other as enemies. And that the only thing for him that you can resolve to is reason. You have to leave the passion out of it. That the only thing that we can see as a connection between us is the law. And there's a certain amount of wisdom in what he's saying, that if you're wanting to rely upon the transient nature of passion to forge together an identity or to forge together a political motion or a nation in general, you're going to have to constantly keep having crises, and you're going to have that are external to any particular partisan group. And that's no way to govern. And it's no way to create a stable republic. So the only thing you can rely on is something that isn't transient, and that's the law. So I think that's a useful thing to be reminded of. We do have an infrastructure set where we can rely on this. Mark Lilla has a book about the once and future liberal, if you've come across this. It's not a very long book, where he says, and he's arguing against identity politics, but the point still stands. You have to rely on a foundation of citizenship. You have to see that tie as the primary tie through the law, not I think abortion's bad, you don't, you're my enemy, right? Instead, there has to be something that underscores the partisan division.
Like a process, or the process of law, or a procedural deferment of passion into something external to the two parties that are arguing?
So that I struggle with this a bit. There's another at Harvard, Michael Sandel has a really excellent book on this, Democracy's Discontent, from the late 90s, where he talks about because we put so much faith in the process of making law, or we see the law through the lens of like a bureaucrat, instead of the law as something that you live. It's a set of regulations or procedures, not a mindset. What we end up doing is breaking apart on these partisan lines about bureaucratic instances, instead of seeing the law as something that's a little bit more, metaphysical is the wrong word, a little bit less procedural. It's something that's more connected to identity than to a specific bureaucratic practice. So I think in that way, he's talking more along the Lincoln line. The law is something that you do. It's something that's a kind of lifestyle. It's not just how does, the Schoolhouse Rock thing, how does a bill become a law, and, these very narrow procedures. And I suppose the way I would frame it is the law is something that everyone has to own. You have to have it. It's not just something that you interact with when you get caught speeding or something. Okay. Right.
But is reason out of reach of the human being? Is there any way to make a culture that's built out of something as abstract as codified laws?
Man, you cut right to the jugular, don't you? Because that is the big question. So there are, and I'm sure you're completely familiar with Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and the debates that have happened between these guys, in particular between Peterson and Harris. And I think that's the question they're actually arguing about. How much can your identity be based on your reason versus how much can it be based on something that's irrational? And again, because I tend toward the ancients a bit, using reason as a foundation for identity may not be terribly functional, particularly for the masses. And I don't want to sound overly anti-democratic there, but it may be true.
It's not the masses as in like the large amount of idiots out there. It's not that. Right. It's that when we're all interacting as a mass, we are necessarily dumbed down because everybody's specialized in a very small thing, and we're all amateurs in most of our lives. So as a mass, we are a mass. So I don't think it's necessarily an elitist thing.
Though there is certainly a part of it that is elitist, in the sense that, well, you have to, if you're going to argue something based on merit, you're inherently going to be an elitist. Okay. Yeah. Right. You have to. So but the thing about citizenship isn't rational. It's basically a construct of where you're born. We test that and make it a little bit more fluid in the past century and a half, maybe. America is incredibly unusual in that regard because you can opt in. And so the mass has sort of gone that way. But citizenship, going like all the way back to the ancient world, was a consequence of birth. Like for the Athenians, both of your parents had to be an Athenian. The Romans only sort of like tear that apart when they need more soldiers to go die against the Germans. And so they expanded outward. But it's really a set of cultural practices, a certain amount of biases and prejudices. And I don't think those words are bad. You need to have certain prejudices. You need to be prejudiced against like prejudice, so to speak. Right.
Up to the point where you become too bigoted against bigotry.
Right. And that, the question really is how educated is your prejudice? Richard Dawkins or something, it clearly has a prejudice against theistic thinking, but he has it grounded in a certain educated structure where he sees it as an educated form of prejudice, which is fine, right? It's a justified way of thinking. You can disagree with him too, right? You can be a pious fool or an impious fool, or the opposite. Trying to go back to your question, I've meandered off a bit. Can we use reason here as a means of doing it or overcoming the passion? I don't know that there's an alternative. The question ends up being, what kind of reason do you rely on? And again, the Federalist here may be useful. The best we can probably do is self-interest. It's going to be more harmful if we continue going down this path than the alternative. But I'm not sure we'll be able to reason ourselves out like through a mathematical equation.
But self-interest is something that you can reliably rely upon to function.
Yeah, right. That's right. We're always selfish. We can always rely on people to be selfish.
Is that why maybe the quote-unquote American dream and that whole collection of values and aspirations was so effective for the period that it was? I see it's under attack a lot now. It's kind of out of fashion, but that seems like one narrative way of binding somebody to citizenship. It's irrational, but it focuses your attention both on what you can get out of the situation and what you can share with everybody else.
Sure. So by the American dream is always such because it's so fluid. It's such a fluid concept or term. I suppose I would say, because I think we're referring basically to the period after the Second World War until like 1980, right? And it's really helpful when the rest of the world's in rubble to rise above something like that, right? It makes things a little more attainable. But there's also a systematic way of approaching it where to go at the 10,000 foot level and then come back down to the more specific. Like if you look at the way that economics are sort of distributed, and I think about this through someone like Andrew Carnegie or William Graham Sumner, these thinkers at the end of the 19th century, how much wealth can be concentrated and still have people believe in the concentration of wealth? Like the fact that we're talking to each other through a device that allows us to communicate in real time where you're on the West Coast, right?
About 2,000 miles away.
It's only possible because of a massive concentration of wealth and effort that's able to create the device and the infrastructure and the network that connects us. So there's a great benefit that comes from having a concentration of wealth. But the consequence of it is certain people don't believe it's possible for them. So there's a certain condition you have to be in where you say, I have the opportunity to also accumulate a massive amount of wealth and along with it, improve my status in life, because it's not just the wealth, it's the honor that comes with it and the comfort. Or I don't have the opportunity to do that. And in terms of the empirical evidence, this is not my area of expertise, but from what I've come across on this, it's still pretty fluid. Yeah, you still have a pretty good opportunity to move between economic classes. It's just less fluid than it used to be.
And that fluidity might have been a fluke.
And this is an interesting. I think that's also true of the way we talk about the media. The incredibly unusual concentration of information from the end of the Second World War into the creation of the internet. that's unheard of. That there were only 3 tunnels of information that you could get, and now there's a countless amount, and everybody's freaking out. Well, this is the normal condition, or the closer to normal condition than it was prior. There's another really good book on this, Post-Broadcast Democracy, that talks about this, the really difficult nature of our identities in a republic that's so thin. The citizenship in America is very, very thin.
What do you mean by thin?
It's based on principle, not on bloodline or soil.
Okay.
Right. So it's far easier to rally like Putin getting to rally the Russians into incorporating the Russian people back into a nation state. You can't really do that here because there is no such thing. The American people is a set of principles or ideas, which makes it by definition very thin, but very permeable. It's how we can have such a multicultural condition. But the way you rally that or the way you construct it is you have to all believe you live in the same place. And if you don't all have the same information, you don't believe you live in the same place. So the American dream idea, or the happy days era of America, may have been a consequence of a deeply restricted access to information, that everybody was sort of funneled through the same lens, so they saw the world in the same way. That's all been shattered. And so what do you do?
Yeah. In one of your articles on Aereo magazine, you talk about a condition of sympathology.
Yep.
You're critiquing identity politics. And,
that's how I say it manifests right now. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, in a sense, the identity politics, or at least progressivism, was initiated, or this current wave of progressivism was initiated to make opportunity more permeable, to give more people access to opportunity by calling out roadblocks in that opportunity. And somewhere along the line, it's turned into actually attacking what makes the principles of America permeable. Now they're focusing more and more on the white male, like having all the power, and we need to take it away and redistribute it, rather than making that construct of whiteness and maleness not matter with regards to your economic rising and falling. They're making it matter more and more and more. So it seems like it might have initiated towards making it more welcoming and distributing the wealth more, but now it seems like it's making a misstep by making it by focusing the angst on an enemy.
So again, I want to go up to 10,000 feet and then come back down if I can. So the modern iteration of progressivism, at least the American version of it, the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, somewhere in that ballpark. But it's drawing from 18th century ideas like the German philosopher Hegel, who argues that, history is fundamentally progressive. It's a working out of these dichotomies, these self-dissolving contradictions. And that gets in some ways picked up by Marx, and then that manifests itself in that way. We don't need to go into that. Not too much, but its influence has been, profound, especially in the academy. And from my understanding, you've seen at least the grandchildren of this effect at Evergreen. But what's interesting in some ways about postmodernism is that it rejects the idea of any grand narrative, which means it has to reject the narrative that history is by definition progressive. So in some ways, we're working towards progress that isn't inevitable. So there's a sense of urgency, right? Everything's a calamity all the time. But what are you progressing toward? And this is one of the problems that in Marx, that, what does it look like? Well, we'll figure it out when we get there. Okay. So what you're really arguing for is change, not progress. And you get trapped in this condition where, like when Dennis Rodman was always changing his hair or whatever for the cameras back in the 90s, everybody got excited. Oh my God, well, that's not really progress, guys. His hair color doesn't make him a better basketball player. And so I see some of that manifesting itself today under the label of progressivism, where when you compare that to the progressives in America in the 20th century, the early 20th century, it's very clear the things that they think progress looks like. It's more democracy. It's the expansion of voting rights. it's the temperance movement, which everybody gets pissed off about, but that's part of it. It's also the eugenics part, the purification of the species that comes out of the progressive movement. Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court case, is an interesting part of this. Progressivism isn't all good. There are parts of it that are deeply dark. Social Darwinism is part of progressivism. It's this sort of dark under part of it that the Nazis grab a hold of, and rightfully we call it bad because it's bad. Yeah. But the so that part of elements in progressivism we want to run away from because of its association with Nazism. But there's this problem. What does the ideal human being look like? And and the Enlightenment asks us that question, assuming that we can get one. And progressivism also asks that question: what kind of ideal person are we looking at? I don't know that the modern iteration has a good answer for that. And so in the piece, the sympathology piece, what I end up asking, or at least examining, who is worthy of your pity, I think is really the question of that whole essay. And again, I think the identity politics piece is the word that this is the most manifest, but we already saw the inverse of this would be with Nazis. Jews aren't worthy of pity, right? So it's not something that's specific to identity politics, or the modern progressive version of it. Instead, it's more of a question, who's disgusting?
Yeah, who's worthy of antipathy? Yeah,
right. It's whoever's disgusting. You can't have pity for this. So when it comes to the identity politics, the progressive side, the stuff that happened at Evergreen or that happened at Yale or all the other places where this has gone on.
What's happening right now on Twitter? What's happening right now in current public discourse?
Yeah, right. No one has any idea about anything. Because if you ask them, what makes this bad? What's power? Well, what is power? Right? No way. It'll be something about language, or it'll be something about vested history, right? And
you're talking about like the assaults on Kavanaugh because of his identity group, or because he's elitist, or is that what you're referring to?
No. More broadly than that, to the question of white male, et cetera, et cetera. What in those things necessarily make it bad? If you can't give a one sentence answer to that, I'm not sure you understand why it's bad. And especially when it starts to unspool against a little bit of examination, it doesn't seem so much to be, it's difficult to phrase this without coming across as completely rejecting it, because there are criticisms that come out of postmodernism that can be useful. And not that all of the whole system is, but some of it can. Well, why are we thinking about it this way? Or why is this interpretation better than that interpretation? These kinds of things. But when it comes down to the radical relativism and the profound skepticism, well, it's going to destroy itself. It has to. And I think what we're seeing some ways in this is a quest for identity. And I use that in a really broad term. Who am I and where do I fit? And what the university really does a poor job of, and I think education more broadly and the culture because of it, we do a horrible job of teaching people that. How do I make friends? Who are my friends? How do I, understand the various relationships that I have with all the people I interact with in my life? Identity politics, in a certain way, gives people very clear lines that are delineated. This is good. This is bad. And it's a really useful hat you can put on. The problem is that the lines they don't make any sense. And the idea, and again, so I'll go through the piece, the sympathology piece for a second, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The word cosmopolitan is, especially used by liberals today, as a good thing, right? Cosmopolitanism is sort of the goal. If you believe in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, that's an incredibly cosmopolitan document. And this is good. Okay. But the word cosmos from the Greek means to be well ordered, right? It's also why it's the root of the word cosmetics. But it can also mean to be superfluous, to be too ordered in a certain sense. But it also means to be homeless. Someone who's cosmopolitan isn't grounded in anything. You sort of just float around. And so as there's this drive to become more cosmopolitan, to be a citizen of the world, so to speak, well, if you're a citizen of the world, where's home? It can't be the world, right? That's who are you going to fight for? Who are you going to die for, right? And so that's one of the things I try to talk about in there, that we're naturally tribal creatures, but we're trying to make ourselves into a tribe of cosmopolitans. But those two words are inherently contradictory. And what identity politics does, sort of grabbing from the Marx tradition, is seeing everything in terms of a class distinction that's not bound by any sort of political system, right? It's not that all the white people in Britain have to rally together or whatever. It's across the planet. And so there's a cosmopolitan element in it that dissolves politics. And so along with it, it dissolves any conception of localized identity. So what I often see in these students is my identity is under attack, or you're denying my existence, or whatever the hyperbolic thing is. And for a certain sort of sense, that's crazy, because no one's actually going to like harm you, especially if you're at Yale or something. But the underlying sort of psychology there is, I think what they're actually saying is, I don't know who I am. And I don't know how to go about making who I am. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to latch onto sort of the most superfluous things I can grab onto, my skin color, my genitals, my faith, my lack of faith, whatever, my gender identity, because it gives you a sense of control, I think.
It seems like that comes with the cost of the people who end up, the young people who end up in that, pinning all of their identity on these superfluous characteristics that they have. That's inherently unstable, because they're completely superfluous. There's no work. Well, I guess you can do a lot of work on your presentation of gender, right?
Sure.
You can change your gender, put a lot of work into that, but it completely relies on perception of other people. Other people need to see that you're this or that gender, that you're this or that race. And so I think that they end up gravitating towards more and more hyperbole, just to make it feel real. Like it gets into this feedback loop where it's not real, so I need to make it feel real. And it goes way out of bounds really quickly.
The way that, just thinking, I was lecturing last night on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I won't go too far into the weeds. I've been name dropping a lot in this talk, so I don't want to do too much of that. But Rousseau is perhaps the first and one of the most serious critics of liberalism. And he says that sort of the three main drives, or you could reduce it to be a little bit reductive to him. We can reduce things down to three drives, which are pity, self-love, and vanity. And he's not entirely sure in one of his books, Emile, that self-love and vanity aren't the same thing. And what you end up doing is, instead of having an independent kind of existence, you become completely reliant on the people around you to affirm who you are. And the reason that you do that is it feels good. People like to be told that they're good or they're awesome, right? And or that they're talented or the rest of it. And so you end up seeking out those things which inflame your vanity, but have very little to do with your life. It certainly doesn't make you good, not for someone like Rousseau. And I don't want to be misunderstood as that saying that this is a Rousseauian critique of identity politics. I'm not going to go that far. But I would say that he sees that as a problem latent in liberalism itself, that it causes people to care too much about external goods, that you care about, how tall is my grass in my yard? Oh, how nice is my china set, or whatever, how nice is my car, that your value is determined on your material goods. He doesn't go so far like a Marx, but he does say that there's a big problem with this because you confuse your material good as your moral good. And that this sort of undermines itself, just because you're wealthy, it doesn't mean you're moral. It actually definitionally it couldn't for him. So for people who are engaging in this kind of gender construction, the question for someone like Rousseau is, well, would you do it outside of society? Right? Would you engage in this kind of activity disconnected from the network, or is this a direct consequence of the fact that you live in a community that cares about vanity, and that what you're trying to do is engage in a kind of recognition of honor? You want people to recognize your goodness, so to speak, so you perform this kind of vanity, instead of saying, well, the act itself or the drive isn't connected to your vanity. It's connected to your pity for another, or fundamentally for your self-gratification or something like this. And so what we could take out of that, I suppose, for some sort of use is people who are engaging in this kind of gender construction, which, like Judith Butler's argument on this, that gender is performative. I'm not sure anyone can completely dismiss that. That sort of gender exists, or sort of sans interaction. Well, no, but is it only that is the question. And people who are engaging in this kind of thing, the question really is more of a psychological one than a political one. So I'm not going to go into that too much. That's not what I study. But there is a political ramification to it, which is when you atomize to this point, when everything becomes so holistically individual, how do you have any concept of we or us? And I think you see this connected in the language of allyship. There's no friendship here. There's no concept that we can be friends across the divides that or whatever. The best we can do is engage in a mutual benefit in the war. And how isolating that must feel to someone, to think that their entire interaction or their entire life is predicated in the conflict, that there is no conception of establishing friendship.
And the problem with that, the main problem with that in my studies on the situation at Evergreen, is that you're so divorced from your own self-worth that your actions don't matter anymore. Like, it doesn't matter how you act. You can be as uncivil as possible. You can even break laws, because somehow you're no longer chained to personal responsibility. You're only chained to just that becoming that performer. That actor that can't is beyond judgment somehow on the stage.
And I keep trying to understand it from their point of view. So I want to try to be as generous to every point of view as possible. And so in reading through Butler's book, which I think there's a lot of this derives from that, her argument almost seems to be that parody, which I think is what they're doing. They're engaging in a kind of parody of the majority norms, is righteousness. It's the only means one has for dismantling systems that are unjust. You can't go through and tear it apart directly. The only thing you can do is sort of render it irrelevant by parodying it, sort of using comedy or irony to dissolve these institutions. And like Martha Nussbaum has an scathing rebuke of this. No. If you want to change systems that are unjust, you got to go do something, right? Go get elected, go change the law, act involved in using the system. Or if you think the system can't be remedied, you have to go through and overthrow the thing. And that doesn't seem to be, there wants to be a notion that we can save a corrupt system by parodying it. Because just by engaging in parody, we're going to reduce the injustice or something. And the best way to sort of do that is to slowly go through and dismantle these systems. But I don't actually see, and again, the Evergreen position far, far better than I do, because I don't have that direct experience. But it doesn't seem like anybody's calling for the destruction of the university. It's really, the problem is who's occupying the positions of power. And so it can't actually be that the power vested in the institution is the problem. It's the people who are using it. And it's not how it's being used. It's merely the person that's using it. And so that ends up going back to our original conversation about the law, it means having rule of, in this case, gender fluid people instead of the law, right? You could have rule of man or rule of law. Well, in this case,
okay.
it's not man, it's going to be a gender fluid person. And that's the appropriate way of going about this or remedying the injustice. I've really been struck by it because I don't know how, and I hope if somebody watches this and they can direct me to a good paper or essay on this, I don't know how the thing which is the cause of your oppression, so your gender or your biology or your race, whatever, is also the means to your liberation. Huh. I don't know how it can be both. How being a woman or being African American or whatever is both the cause of your oppression and the means to your freedom. I don't know how it's not always going to be a cause of your oppression. I don't know how it's self-liberating.
If it's the cause of you being able to oppress other people, then maybe it'll solve your oppression.
So that's the Marxist interpretation, right? That the problem with the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is you just got to kill the bourgeoisie, right? And so the proletariat now gets to oppress itself, and establish the dictatorship of itself. And you go, okay, you're not going to live in a liberated society then, right?
Yeah. Well, how do we to go way back, to go back to civility, which I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is injecting empathy back into the conversation, is learning more about empathy and communication rather than oppression and privilege the key towards unifying us and finding my me and our we at the same time?
Yeah, so this is good. This is a really good question. And I want to think about it in terms of the theater, like in terms of movies and TV shows and this kind of stuff. Because, boy, that gets people riled up now, right? Who gets represented and who is doing the representing?
Yeah.
And that gets, all kinds of anger and consternation over this. That's not a question of what kind of character should you cry for, right? It's really whom is being represented and doing the representing. The assumption of empathy there, which is the question of who do you cry for, assumes a kind of universality to the human experience. If you're framing everything in terms of who's being represented, it doesn't. By definition, it won't. And perhaps there are absolutely legitimate concerns regarding representation, and especially in a multicultural society. The Hamilton musical I love this musical. It's fabulous. It fundamentally asks that question: are you capable of crying for someone who doesn't look like you? And if you've ever been exposed to it, the answer is yeah. Oh yeah, you can. And it doesn't matter because it's fundamentally the story is so deeply human. But I think there's also a more political side to that, which is can a multicultural people or a multi-ethnic people cry for itself? Can you get white people to cry for black people to cry for Latino people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that's really a question of representation, because Alexander Hamilton was, he was not Latino. Or Aaron Burr is as white as Wonder Bread, right? Or not anymore, he's dead, but he was. And so that's not even a question anymore, right? That element has been removed because you've changed the person that's presenting the character. The question is, are you crying for the character, or are you crying for the person presenting the character?
Right.
And so I think that's where I think this is why the people who are frequently active on like Twitter get really angry about this. They're asking the wrong question. So when it comes to civility, can you engender in people a kind of empathy for those who aren't like them? And at how far can you push that? Is the limit you're at the level of the political? Is it the level of the family? Is it the level of the race? Is it the level of the class? And there's not a clear, very good answer about this. It's frequently because this character is non-white, then the person presenting it, or like with the Scarlett Johansson one, she's not trans, right? Does that require that the person playing it, in order to understand the nature of the character, come from that point of view, right? That in a certain sense, films mean to be more like documentaries and not fiction. Well, does that limit our capacity to create stories that we are going to cry about or laugh over? Can you only make movies for Black people that are made by people who are African American, for people that are African American of a particular walk of life that engage in particular kinds of things? Well, then that completely destroys the capacity to empathize outside of that system.
Or imagine, yeah.
Right. And so the question on the political level about civility, I think, is really a cultural question. Because I don't know that you can engender political civility or a political kind of empathy if it's not being reinforced outside of the halls of power.
Within culture, you're saying.
Right. I'm not sure that the two things can necessarily be untethered.
Well, the thing is that one of the key actors of the Evergreen protests, one of his refrains, or their refrains, and he's parroting the teacher Naima Lowe, who is one of the largest, one of the biggest actors from the faculty in the whole unrest, that you can't understand me because I'm Black. And you have no idea what it's like to be me. And I'm Black, and then I'm also queer, and then I'm this, and I'm that. It just, it reinforces this separateness, which is aimed towards sacredness, by which I mean, you can't even touch me. You can't judge me. You don't know me. You can't touch me. Therefore, you have to follow what I say. You have to let me redesign the system. And so there's that leap from the empathetic into the political, but by which I mean there's somebody that you can't know, and therefore there's somebody you have to obey because you don't. They know you don't know. And Robin DiAngelo, with the whole white fragility myth, if it's even strong enough to call a myth, is just trying to reinforce that you can't know these people. So basically, you have to let me guide you into being servile to them. The standpoint epistemology stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And I probably should be careful with some of this because this is not the major thing I study. And so I want to hedge everything in this, that some of it may be more speculative than it should be, and I probably should bite my tongue. But what I would, I suppose what I would say, trying to understand this, I'll put on my Aristotle hat for a second and try to understand this, because he argues in his politics that all cities are made up of a plurality. It's not an extended family. You're not all going to be necessarily, you're not blood related. You may be related to your tribe structure, or for us, the ethnicity. That's where the word comes from. Ethnos means the people or the tribe, and that you may be connected there. But in order to live in a political system, for him, the city, the polis, you can't just have one. He's arguing against Plato on this, that you shouldn't actually want it to be one. That's not good, because that's fundamentally not political. It's a family association. So when you're having arguments that are at that level, you're not actually engaging in things that are political. You're moving the political down into the level of the familial, into the level of the family. Which doesn't surprise me, since the sort of the banner cry for 20 years is the personal is the political. Those two things are getting fused together, in the sense that now everybody talks about ideology as the only measure of worth in some ways. And you'll see this on Twitter all the time. I'm a liberal. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, what the hell that is, or whatever, right? All the other elements that go along with it, and it's just on and on and on and on and on. And that actually doesn't really tell you anything about that person, right? But somehow that's the new banner that we take and run with. And the identity politics effort is to say which one of those banners is legitimate. Is it the race? Is it the gender? Is it which one of these do you hold up to say it's legitimate? And then which one of them are worthy of recognition?
again, I think it comes down to a question of who gets honored and why.
Yeah.
So you
exactly.
pointing it to the question of the sacred, I think, is absolutely right. That I don't go so far to say that it's a new religion. I think a lot of people do. I think you draw the parallels to that in some ways. And I think you can see the structure that's certainly there. There's no way of redemption, and there's no way of life. Really, like how do you spend your Tuesdays as an identity politics religious observer, right? I don't think there is one. And the so what you end up getting sort of left with is, if everything is about inflamed ideology, and I actually hate that word, because I don't think it means what we say it means. Because like an ideology would be understanding the forms, right? Understanding the nature of things would be an ideology. These are ideocrats, people who think they have power in their knowledge or power in whatever. And that's what they're doing. It's a contest. And not only do I know what the truth is, because I know the truth, I have power, and I should have power, right? And any questioning of the truth is an act of injustice. It's a going against the legitimate exercise of power, and people want to attribute that to the postmodernists, but that's really the question of political philosophy.
Yeah, it dates back,
right? But it's like what is power, and who gets to have it, and who gets to use it legitimately. That's always the question. Right? Because power is something that's sort of ubiquitous with human beings. It's going to be in every society, everywhere, and someone's going to be using it. Those are empirical questions. Whether it's legitimate or not, that's not an empirical question. That's something that goes beyond mere observation. And I think that's really, we don't know. How do you justify the legitimate use of authority if you think all legitimate uses of authority are oppressive?
Yeah. Well, there's that level, and then there's the divorcing or the prizing of characteristics over character. Like, so now we're looking at characteristics, white, black, male, female, instead of looking at like what kind of a person are you, which I think is more of a literary question or a moral question or even a religious question. Like by which I mean you need to have a story, you need to have a narrative where these different characters can, articulate themselves upon whatever background you choose, so that we can start to identify what are good characteristics and what are bad characteristics, not on the outward, very surface level, but like in dialogue with another person or in relationship to another person. Right.
Yeah, the Jungian archetypes and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
And and so I think I agree with that in a certain sense. John Rawls, you familiar with Rawls and the theory of justice?
A little bit, yeah, theory of justice.
So the question ends up being, I want to address that one, but I want to let that process in the back of my mind for a second before I make a fool of myself. For Rawls, like a question would be, do the characteristics draw upon you bad things, right?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Right? And I think in that sense, this is where I think the movement of identity politics and this push that starts in the 60s, this is the part that's absolutely legitimate and no one should disregard. That if the distribution of goods or the distribution, we could say even of justice itself, is limited by your characteristics, that's wrong.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
It's fundamentally incorrect. And that has nothing to do with your behavior. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
If you're being mistreated because of your skin color, that's fundamentally wrong, and or a violation of justice. And so, if you have a system that's built on this, for example, I ask my students here, if you ever fly over the Midwest, what does it look like? It's just like a little patchwork of squares, right? And why is this? Well, because of two acts that were passed under the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Territory in 1785 and 1787, said that these things have to be laid out this way because you have to have a common schoolhouse every so far. Yeah. Now, if you fly over the South, it doesn't look like that. It's these massive swaths of land, these huge partitions. Well, why do they need that? Well, because they needed it for the plantations, right? So even the geography itself has this built into it.
Okay.
The question ends up being, do those large swaths of land today in the counties or the squares in the Midwest, does that affect the distribution of justice? Well, no, right? How could it? You'd have to go pretty far into that to say that it does, even though its historical circumstance absolutely is predicated on it.
Yeah.
Right? So there's that question that goes along, and I think that's where you can diverge from the absolute legitimate concern with the inappropriate application of justice based on your characteristics, right? Don't listen to women, they're hysterical, right? Well, that's wrong. It's fundamentally unjust. But then you can go in and say, well, women weren't listened to in the past, therefore they have to be listened to now.
Yeah.
That's a non sequitur, right? You would say that the act here is unjust, but the act in the past doesn't justify the current condition. Where character becomes a question, really is at the point of that individual locus, right? That's really where the concern is. If you have framed your understanding of character through this lens of past characteristics, the level of the current character doesn't matter, right? It couldn't. It would say, no, that doesn't matter because the decision making has already happened prior to the event.
Yes. Yeah.
And so now the debate really is how deeply embedded are you in your history? And how much are you a consequence of historical forces versus not?
Well, and that's different than being knowledgeable. Being embedded is being different knowledge.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That's right. Well, because it actually, and the level of an action, it wouldn't matter, right? It would be the historical circumstances are as such that your prejudice or your biases exist even beyond your knowledge. Even if you don't know you're engaging in a way that's prejudiced, it's still prejudiced.
Okay.
Right? I think that I'm trying to best understand that perspective, and I would say the gap in the argument that happens between them happens in that situation. People who want to understand things purely on the question of character have to understand an event sans history, right? Or as an isolated incident. And people who don't, from this point of view anyway, are going to say, well, the individual action doesn't really matter. It's a question of historical circumstance and condition. And the question ends up being, well, at what point do the sins of the father not descend to the child, right? How much culpability do you have for your ancestors? How far back do you go? And like this is the Burke problem. You keep going too far back, everybody is horrible, right? Yeah. There's no good human being. Everybody's horrible. So how far does the culpability go? And this is where something like in Judaism or in Christianity, or in some ways in Islam, the Abrahamic tradition, there has to be a way of expunging past sins, right? Yeah. Otherwise, how do you ever move forward? And that's where I think that this sort of question ends up becoming, if it's immutable, if my existence as a white man will always cause oppression, there's nothing I can do ever.
Well, you can kill yourself, right?
Right. Well, that's a ridiculous notion.
Okay, that's out of the.
Yeah. I mean, because how could that ever be? How could that ever be a just system? On its face, it would have to be, But I think the argument is what you can try to do is dismantle the systems that give you that oppressive power. I'm not particularly sure how you're supposed to do that if by using the power and dismantling the power, I'm still vested with the power. So I'm not, I guess, unless I destroy the whole system. But again, this comes back to that condition with Evergreen. They didn't want to burn the school down. No. They just wanted to change who was using the power. So there's sort of two end goals that are mutually exclusive. I don't know how you reconcile them.
But it works in a very myopic, very hyper emotional environment that makes sense in a very compacted, immediate, urgent environment. To organize power in that way. But it's totally ridiculous anybody removed in space or time or culture from them looking in at Evergreen. At least that 3 days of protests, they're so novel to so many people. They don't make any sense. And I've spent a year and a half like trying to unspool that, and it all comes back to these other ideas that just met the perfect chemical reaction in that moment.
Right. And so if you don't mind, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
On what was it like to, because I've watched some of your videos on this and the deconstruction that you've done through it. How do you do this? The level of hostility that seemed to have been present, did you know it was coming? Or was it something where you woke up and went, this is fireworks on campus, where did this come from?
I wasn't. I was in the periphery of that. Okay, the main protest day where they blockaded the library, I was in the library when they did that, and then my next class that weekend or the next weekend, the entire dynamics were replicated in the classroom, and I wasn't totally surprised, but I wasn't not shocked. I was shocked because of the way that the power was being wielded. It was handed to them by the professor handed 3 students of dark complexion the power. They proceeded to decry and attack everybody based on their characteristics. When one young woman got really confused because she was demanded that she speak because white silence is violence. And then she's like, well, what do you mean by that? They told her to shut the fuck up. And so there was this, and then they started toying with her until she started crying, and then they started laughing at her.
Yeah.
So it was just
pathology, right?
It was just like it was very disturbing that to watch that, because they were having so much glee in that, and I'd seen that before. I'd seen it, and then I saw like all the talks on privilege. I saw that repeatedly the white cis heterosexual man repeatedly bagged on and laughed at and joked at. And if you were one, you needed to apologize. So it was already in place. Everything was already in place in that. All you needed was some charismatic people, and then the spring energy, and then a bunch of hormones. And then there you go.
So it sounds like you just described the French Revolution, but on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely.
All of the pieces were there. It just needed the spark.
Yeah.
The thing that I suppose for me, I look at this and I go, this could have been a really noble endeavor to make people care about those that don't look like them, that don't think the way that they do, the way that they don't have sex the way that they do, or have their same relationship to sex the way that you do. It could have been incredibly noble in that way to expand empathy, but that's not the path that was chosen.
That was not the path that they were set upon.
And
that's not the path of privilege. When you start talking about anti-oppression and privilege, that is by definition, it's unempathetic. Like in training courses, they would make lists of who has the most privilege, just like freaking Hitler would do. And you just like, you name all these characteristics, which is anti-empathetic.
So I usually try to run away from comparison to the Nazis.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's cheap. It's cheap blow, but like, it was just amazing I was watching that happen.
Well, because you can also see it in the people that did phrenology in the 19th century do the same stuff, right? Human beings like to make categories.
Yes.
And we like to attach meaning to the categories, especially moral significance to them.
Yeah.
But what you could do, and I think this is where in some ways the Marxist underpinnings of some of this stuff become a big problem, because I do think that's right. The only way that you can go after a fellow human being devoid of any moral content is if you make them disgusting. And that fundamental, and having the attributes of someone who is listed as disgusting, it's not like anybody goes, oh boy, that feels good, right? It's not a good thing. But I also have been incredibly lucky I've only ever gone to state schools, and I've taken sociology classes. I've been exposed to some of these ideas. Like we learned about white privilege and we learned about these kinds of things. But the notion was never, it was really more of a question of individual responsibility, not collective action. And again, that's a way you could have made the effort noble. Recognize the condition that you have and the position that you have, and be aware that not everyone comes at it from that point of view. Okay, right? That can be something that's useful. It can be illuminating, but that's the starting point, not the ending point. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the big difference, perhaps, in what shifts from having this as an academic point of view versus an activist point of view.
Yeah, exactly.
And the problem is, how much culpability do academics have for their ideas that get manifest in a way that they didn't intend, versus how many of them created ideas that they knew would be manifest in this way? And right, so where does the moral culpability lie there? And that is way above my pay grade. I'm not going to try to do that whatsoever.
But it's not just academics. Within colleges, academics are having less and less power. Administration and student life. Student life is what's having more and more power.
Yeah, and your HR departments, your hiring processes, your the way in which students are brought in, for their first days, their opening seminars. But that didn't happen in a vacuum.
No,
and it had to have had. Yeah, it has traction because of the ideas which precede it by 20 years.
Exactly.
And so you end up becoming in this untenable condition where why do you go to school? And right, what's the point of this whole stupid thing? Why do we give people the first 20 or 25 years of their lives to sit around and learn stuff?
Yeah.
You're just going to spend a quarter or more of your life like learning about like Avogadro's number in chemistry or something, okay, or trying to understand what these equations in physics are. Or you can take a class from me and I drive you crazy by asking, well, why do you think that, right? Why do you believe this? Drive you nuts. And what's the whole point of this thing, right? And what I think that this has fundamentally seized on, there's an answer to that. Jonathan Haidt had that essay a couple of years ago about the two the two ends of the university. And that one you can create activists, the other one you can sort of create scholars. And I think what's really missed is what's supposed to be produced are citizens.
Yeah.
Right. What's the point of a public education unless there's a public benefit?
Yeah.
And just have all private schools and just go back to the model before we were paying for this stuff publicly.
Yeah. That's very freaking Greek of you to bring it back to citizenship.
It is. Because I'm not sure there's another way. I don't know that there's a better identity to latch onto than that. And people will argue, the critique, I suppose, that's going to come from a postmodernist or an identity politics person is, well, of course you're going to say that because you're vested with the power. Well, the point of citizenship is that all the citizens are vested with the power. When they're not, that's a concern for all the citizens, because then that means my power can go away too. Yeah. Back to that self-interested point of view, right? Yeah. I have to care about, this is the Martin Luther King notion, right? That injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. His is more of like a human level, but at the level of the citizen, that has to be true. And, right? Yeah. So, but how do you teach people to think that way? Instead of approaching power itself as the problem.
Yes.
And because power has to exist. Unless no one would want to live in a condition where there's no power, because they're near an Hobbes state of nature. That's the problem with, if you have too much equality, everybody becomes a barbarian, right? And because then everything just comes down to brute force, right? I'll take what I want. The only thing you can do is kill me. And that's a big problem.
Unless it's all arbitrated through computer programs and everybody's just plugged into a video game all the time, and we can constantly live in an imaginary, paradise.
Yeah, the lotus flower cycle, right? Where you can just sit around and get like digitally high all the time.
Yeah.
But then that's another kind of equality. It's an equality of a kind of emotional slavery or psychological slavery, right? Mm-hmm. I'm completely dependent upon this thing. I have no freedom. So both are bad, right? And this is where Tocqueville is useful on this, because like equality is absolutely necessary for living in a free society. Too much of it can kill you, and in either kind of direction. But this is where asking that question, why are you even doing this or engaging in an education at all? We've talked a little bit about back and forth on the importance of a liberal arts education, and what exactly is that thing? And because Evergreen is a liberal arts school, right? And from everything I've picked up on, the way that they approach pedagogy and curriculum is like some of the neatest things that you can do. And the deep immersion, the way in which you think across curricula, you sort of degrade or make porous the distinctions between the disciplines. So you're trying to think more broadly. That's fabulous. I mean, that's really,
it's a wonderful model.
That I didn't have that going to school.
Exactly.
I was lucky because my undergrad advisor went to Rutgers in the 70s, and they were doing that in the 70s there. So he taught me to think about everything through that porous conception. That's completely idiosyncratic to me, that very few people are going to have that experience unless you go to a school that's designed for that.
Yeah.
But by breaking down the silos, you, in some ways, could make yourself susceptible to systems of thinking that have already destroyed the silos.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but a liberal arts education, so to speak, is, is it a little bit of this, a little bit of that, the cafeteria model? Like, I'm going to take a little bit of Shakespeare, I'm going to take a little bit of Freud, I'm going to take a little bit of African history, I'm going to take a little bit of Asian pottery, right? And I'm going to get this sort of cosmopolitan education. My advisor would say, I can learn how to order French fries in Italian, right? So now I'm a global citizen, okay? Okay. Is that what it's supposed to be? Or is the liberal arts, again, going back to the antiquity, I mean, the phrase means the skill of being free, the skill of living a free kind of life. And what does that mean? Does that mean you all have to be philosophers? Well, that's a disaster, right? That doesn't work. Like, philosophy is not good for politics. They kill Socrates because of this, right? You ask too many questions and the system starts to corrode.
But a little bit of that.
But a little bit of it's okay. But liberalism in some ways sort of wants us to think philosophically without being philosophers, to be able to analyze and deconstruct. And the more democratic you become, you have to, in some ways, trust that you can educate people to make good decisions, right? Not that they can do mathematical proofs, or that they can go through and do analytic philosophy or any of this kind of stuff. Because, like, the goal of a citizen, this, again, going to Aristotle, I think he was right on this when he's writing in the 4th century as it is now. The goal of a citizen is to make good choices. It's good judgment, to have correct opinions. Right? Which means there are bad ones.
Yeah.
And the process you have to go through is learning how to weigh different claims.
Yeah.
And so the goal
assess
of
different stimuli.
Right.
Especially in the internet age where there's all these different opinions being thrown at you. That's what I was.
And to learn which one of them are bullshit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the most important thing. This is completely incredible. I can't use this. And but so then, in a certain sense, the goal of a liberal arts education is to make citizens, to make people that make good decisions.
Yes. And
the way you do that is by engaging with various ways of thinking and trying to understand the different claims on things. And I have another essay or another piece on this, that the problem is that where you go, critical thinking and scientific thinking are the same thing. I think that's an error that we make, because scientific thinking is based on, it doesn't like having competing claims on the truth. Right? It's either right or it's wrong, or it's in a system of transition where we're not actually totally sure. Like modern physics is a good example of this. Like, we can understand the cosmic level and we can at least give a pretty decent account on the quantum level, but you put them together, right? Okay. And this is where it's not terribly surprising to me that if our physics can't even give an account of reality, or a unified account of reality, is it terribly surprising that people can't give an account of them, right? That they can't ground themselves in an identity if everything is fluid? So that's not terribly surprising. But what we end up getting in trouble with is assuming that because there's only one right answer in science, there's only going to be one right answer in politics or in culture. And what really is, there are competing answers that both could be correct. You just have to choose which one of them is better.
Yeah.
Right? The 2016 election is a really, I think, an interesting example of this. Because it lines up basically with your assessment of Evergreen. It's like, Um, I didn't go, oh my God, how could this possibly happen that the major candidate for one of the major parties in America gets elected president, right? What are you talking about? Of course it could happen.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't, it's just shocking. What? Right? How did this happen? And it's fundamentally because everyone, well, it's a wash. What does it matter, right? If Democrats, she's not pure, I'm going to vote for Jill Stein. Or she's got some corruption, he's got some corruption, everybody's corrupt, what does it matter, right? This sort of thing. That's an abdication of the decision-making process. And that sort of defeats the entire purpose of having a citizen. I can't make a good choice, whatever, just I don't care. And if education isn't going to teach you the ability to make that distinction, and I don't just mean the university or public education, this is also going to come from your culture, it's going to come from your faith or not your faith, from your family, right? The whole system has to be sort of engaged in this, which is why I come back to that issue of citizenship and the law as an identity, not just as a process. It's something that the way you think about the world is grounded in that understanding, because every sort of facet of you is influenced or informed by it. And I don't know how there could be anything more important than that to teach people if you care about living in a free society. If you don't, they don't care about it, right? Just be technocratic. Just worry about this. But if you do care about it and want things like, if you want free speech to mean more than just barking at the moon, right?
Yeah.
Where it has some sort of, you have to then say speech has meaning. And that we can discern between what claims are good or bad when both of the claims can be legitimate. And where it's not a methodological critique where you go, well, this one has bad methods, throw it out. Instead, it's, should taxes be 41% or 38%, right? Well, there's a method for going through that's consequentialist, or there's one that says the way in which we approach the distribution of wealth should err toward the side of concentration or decentralization. But both of them can work, right? The question is, what kind of value set do you want to extend out of that choice? And you have to be able to at least think through, does this one more align with my values or that one? And then make your choice based on that. Not like something, I don't know, one of these stupid things like, oh my God, he put mustard on a hamburger, or oh my God, he wore a tan suit, or the president likes his steak well done eating with ketchup, right? Who cares, right? Those are value things. It's idiosyncratic.
Stephen?
But, yeah.
I'm really sorry. I have to get to my job. I have to...
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I don't need to keep
This is beautiful. Can we do this again?
Sure. I my life is in talking, so I'll talk all the time.
You're really, really good at it.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're a master.
Well, I don't know about that. I have a lot to learn. But no, I'd be happy to. This is fun. I enjoy this.